In the bone-chilling Alaskan cold, Emily Carter hears a faint, desperate groan echoing through the snowy forest, guiding her to a shocking sight: a massive grizzly bear, chained and trembling, its eyes pleading for life. Who did this? What sinister secret lurks in the shadows? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The wind howled through the snow-laden pines, a feral scream that clawed at Emily Carter's skin, slicing through her heavy coat like shards of ice. Each breath she took burned her lungs, the frigid Alaskan air turning her exhales into fleeting clouds of white mist that vanished into the endless gray of the wilderness. She'd trudged through this frozen hell for hours, her boots sinking into the powdery snow, her body numb from the cold. But it wasn't the weather that stopped her dead in her tracks. It was the sound. A sound so faint, so broken, it might have been the wind itself weeping. A low, guttural whimper, raw and desperate, cutting through the silence like a knife through flesh. Her heart slammed against her rib cage, a frantic drumbeat echoing in her ears. She squinted into the distance, her hazel eyes scanning the skeletal trees, their branches drooping under the weight of frost. Nothing, just the endless white, the unrelenting cold. Then it came again, a cry, weak and trembling, tugging at something primal deep inside her. She moved toward it, her steps slow, deliberate, the snow crunching beneath her boots like brittle bones. And then she saw it, a grizzly bear, massive, majestic, broken. Its hulking form loomed against a gnarled pine, but this was no king of the wild. Thick chains, gleaming with frost, coiled around its torso and legs, biting into its matted fur like cruel iron teeth. Ice clung to its coat in jagged clumps, its once powerful body trembling, reduced to a shivering heap of exhaustion and despair. Its head hung low, breath puffing out in shallow, labored bursts, each one weaker than the last. And those eyes, deep, brown, almost human, locked onto hers. Not with the ferocity she'd expected from a beast this size, not with a snarl or a roar, but with something far worse: fear, pain, a silent plea that pierced her soul. Emily's knees buckled, and she sank into the snow, her gloved hands clutching her chest as if to hold her heart in place. She'd seen cruelty before: poachers' traps snapping shut on deer legs, wolf packs starved out by shrinking territories. But this was different. This wasn't nature's indifference. This was deliberate. Someone had chained this bear here, left it to die in agony, its strength drained by the cold, its spirit crushed by abandonment. Her throat tightened, a lump of rage and sorrow choking her. Who could do this? Why? She'd spent 15 years in these woods, tracking wildlife, documenting their lives, fighting the slow bleed of human greed into their world. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, rough and steady, the way it had been before he died out here. The wild's got no one to speak for it, Em. If you don't stand up, who will? He'd been a ranger, a man who'd faced down poachers with nothing but a rifle and a stubborn heart, until one of them put a bullet through that heart. She'd been 16 then, watching her mother sob over a coffin, swearing she'd never let the forest claim her too. But here she was, alone, staring into the eyes of a dying giant, and that old promise felt like a lie. Her fingers twitched toward the survival knife strapped to her belt, the cold metal pressing against her palm through the glove. She could walk away. She should walk away. This wasn't her fight. Not against a bear that could rip her apart with one swipe, not against whatever monster had done this. The rational part of her screamed to turn back, to let nature sort itself out. But those eyes, those damn eyes, held her captive. They weren't just begging for life. They were begging her to be more than the scared girl who'd lost everything to this forest, to be the woman her father had raised her to be. She took a step closer, her breath hitching as the bear shifted, its massive head lifting just enough to track her movement. No growl, no bared teeth, just that haunting gaze, pulling her in like a current she couldn't fight. Her boots sank deeper into the snow, the cold seeping through her soles, but she barely felt it. All she felt was the weight of the choice bearing down on her. Leave, and this bear would die. Slowly, painfully, its last moments a testament to human cruelty. Stay, and she might not walk out of here alive. Her hand tightened around the knife hilt, her pulse racing. She wasn't a hero, she wasn't fearless, but she couldn't turn her back, not on this. The bear let out another whimper, softer now, almost a sigh, and something inside Emily snapped. She dropped to her knees beside it, snow soaking through her pants, her face inches from its frost-crusted muzzle. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the wind. "I'm not leaving you." Her fingers brushed the chain, the metal so cold it burned through her glove. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't some rusted relic of a hunter's mistake. It was new, polished, wrapped with precision around the bear's body, cutting into its flesh, drawing frozen streaks of blood that stained the snow red. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't an accident. This was a death sentence. She yanked her glove off, her bare hand trembling as she touched the bear's fur, icy damp clinging to her skin. She felt the faint rise and fall of its chest, the slow, stuttering rhythm of a life slipping away. "Who did this to you?" she murmured, her voice cracking. The bear's eyes flickered, a spark of something, trust maybe, flaring in their depths. And in that moment, she knew. She couldn't walk away. Not from this bear. Not from the truth hiding in the shadows of these woods. Her eyes darted around the clearing, the silence pressing in, heavy and ominous. The wind carried no answers, but the forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Whoever had done this couldn't be far. The chains were too fresh, the scene too staged. Her breath quickened, mist swirling in the air as she scanned the snow for clues. And then she saw it, a faint line of footprints, human, cutting through the pristine white, leading away from the tree. Her blood ran colder than the ice beneath her knees. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. She stood, her legs shaky, her hands still gripping the knife. The bear's head drooped, its strength fading, and Emily's resolve hardened. She didn't know what she'd find at the end of those tracks, answers, danger, or death. But she couldn't stop now, not when the bear's life hung by a thread. Not when the forest itself seemed to whisper her father's words. "Stand up, Em." She took a deep breath, the icy air searing her lungs, and made her choice. She'd free this bear. She'd find the truth, and whatever came next, she'd face it head on. Emily Carter's breath hung in the air, a fleeting ghost of warmth swallowed by the relentless Alaskan cold. Her bare hand still tingled from the icy fur of the grizzly bear, its faint heartbeat pulsing beneath her fingertips like a fragile thread she refused to let snap. She'd made her choice. There was no turning back now. The footprints in the snow stretched out before her, a sinister trail leading into the unknown, but she couldn't chase them yet. Not while the bear lay chained, its life draining into the frost with every shuddering breath. "Hold on," she whispered again, her voice a raw plea against the howling wind. She couldn't lose it, not to the cold, not to whoever had left it here to rot. Her gloved hand fumbled with the survival knife, pulling it free from its sheath with a soft scrape of metal. The blade glinted under the weak winter light, sharp and steady, but her fingers trembled as she knelt beside the bear. The chains were monstrous, thick, polished steel, wrapped tight around its torso and legs, cutting into flesh until frozen blood crusted the fur. She pressed the knife against the first link, her teeth gritted and sawed. The metal resisted, each stroke a battle, the sound of steel on steel grating against her nerves. Her arms burned, her breath came in sharp gasps, mist swirling around her face. "Come on," she muttered, desperation creeping into her voice. The bear shifted, a low groan rumbling from its chest, and Emily froze, her heart lurching into her throat. Would it lash out? Could it, even now? Its head lifted, just an inch, those deep brown eyes meeting hers again. No rage, no threat, just exhaustion and something else. something that clawed at her chest. Trust. It trusted her. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her, and doubled her efforts. The knife slipped, nicking her glove, but she barely noticed. She had to move faster. The cold was a predator, sinking its teeth deeper into the bear with every passing second. Another groan, weaker this time, and her stomach twisted. "Don't you dare give up on me," she hissed, sawing harder, her muscles screaming in protest. A sharp snap. The first chain broke, clattering into the snow like a gunshot in the silence. Emily exhaled, a shaky burst of relief, but it was short-lived. The bear flinched, its massive body tensing, and she braced herself, knife raised. Nothing. It didn't lunge. It didn't roar. It just watched her, its ribs heaving under the weight of its own survival. She moved to the next chain, her hands steadier now, fueled by a flicker of hope. She'd freed animals before, foxes from snares, deer from traps, but never a grizzly. Never anything this massive, this wild. Her father's words echoed again. "Stand up, Em." She could almost feel his calloused hand on her shoulder, the way it had been when he'd taught her to track, to fight, to care. He'd died for this forest. She wouldn't let it claim this bear too. The second chain gave way, then the third. Each break a small victory, a defiance against the cruelty etched into the scene. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cold, dripping into her eyes, stinging. She wiped it away with her sleeve, her gaze darting to the bear's face. Its breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed, but it was still with her. "Almost there, big guy," she said, her voice softer now, a promise. The final chain was the worst, wrapped around its front legs, digging so deep she could see raw, bloody flesh beneath the ice-crusted fur. Her stomach lurched, bile rising again. This wasn't just restraint, this was torture. She tossed the knife aside, it wouldn't cut through this, and yanked her backpack open, digging frantically. Her fingers closed around the small bolt cutter she always carried, a habit born from years of dismantling poachers' traps. It was light, meant for wire, not steel this thick, but it was all she had. She positioned it over the chain, her hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, and squeezed. The metal groaned, resisting, mocking her. "Come on," she snarled, throwing her weight into it. Her arms trembled, her vision blurred with effort. The bear whimpered, a sound so frail it nearly broke her, and she pushed harder, teeth bared. A crack, then a snap. The chain fell, useless, into the snow. She stumbled back, panting, her chest heaving as she stared at the bear. Free. It was free. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The wind stilled. The forest held its breath. The grizzly shifted, its muscles rippling under its battered coat, and tried to stand. Its legs buckled, trembling, unsteady, but it didn't collapse. Emily's pulse raced, her hands clenched into fists. Would it turn on her now, rip her apart in a surge of wild instinct? She'd seen what bears could do, her father's stories of mauled hunters, shredded camps. But this one didn't move toward her. It lifted its head, those eyes locking onto hers one last time, and she saw it again. Trust, gratitude, a silent bond forged in the crucible of this moment. Then it turned, slow and pained, and limped toward the trees. Each step was a struggle, its massive frame swaying, but it moved, disappearing into the shadows of the pines. Emily exhaled, a ragged sob catching in her throat. She'd done it. She'd saved it. Her legs gave out, and she sank into the snow, the cold seeping through her clothes, her body trembling from exhaustion and relief. The chains lay scattered around her, glinting like accusations in the dim light. She'd won this fight, but the war wasn't over. Her eyes snapped back to the footprints she'd seen before, the human tracks cutting through the snow, sharp and fresh. Her relief evaporated, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She crawled forward, her fingers brushing the edges of the prints. They weren't old. They weren't faded. Someone had been here, recently. Her gaze followed the trail stretching deeper into the forest, toward a darkness she couldn't yet see. And then she spotted it, half buried in the snow a few feet away, a glint of brass. She reached for it, her heart pounding, and pulled it free. A bullet casing, spent, cold. Her breath caught, her mind racing. This wasn't just chaining. Someone had shot at the bear. Maybe to kill it, maybe to capture it. Why? Her fingers tightened around the casing, the metal biting into her palm. The bear was gone, safe for now, but the danger wasn't. Whoever had done this wasn't finished. She stood, her legs shaky but resolute, and glanced back at the tree where the bear had been bound. The scene was a crime, a story half told, screaming for answers. The footprints beckoned, a path to the truth, and her father's voice rang in her ears once more. If you don't stand up, who will? She slipped the casing into her pocket, her jaw tightening. The bear was free, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She took a step toward the trail, the wind picking up, carrying the faint echo of a twig snapping in the distance. Someone was out there, and she was going to find them. Emily Carter stood motionless, the spent bullet casing biting into her palm, its cold brass a silent scream of the violence that had unfolded here. The wind whipped through the pines, tugging at her coat, but she barely felt it. Her eyes traced the human footprints cutting through the snow. Sharp, deliberate, a trail of menace stretching into the darkening forest. The grizzly was gone, its limping form swallowed by the trees, but the danger hadn't left with it. Whoever had chained it, shot at it, was still out there. Close, too close. Her breath misted in the frigid air, quick and shallow, as she slipped the casing into her pocket. The bear was free, but this wasn't over. Not yet. She could still hear her father's voice, steady and unyielding. If you don't stand up, Em, who will? She had to know the truth. She had to follow. Her boots crunched softly as she moved, each step deliberate, her senses razor sharp. The forest loomed around her, a cathedral of ice and shadow, its silence broken only by the occasional creak of a burdened branch or the distant howl of the wind. The tracks were fresh, the edges crisp, untouched by the drifting snow. Whoever had left them couldn't be far. Her hand hovered near the knife at her belt, her pulse a steady thrum in her ears. She wasn't a stranger to these woods. She'd tracked wolves through blizzards, faced down hunters with nothing but a glare and a warning. But this felt different. This wasn't a hunt for survival. This was something darker, something that curdled the air with intent. 15 minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, her legs burning from the uneven terrain. The footprints grew erratic, wider strides, deeper impressions, as if someone had started running. Her stomach tightened. Had they heard her? Seen her free the bear? She crouched low, her fingers brushing the snow. And that's when she saw it. Disturbed patches, deep grooves, claw marks raking the frost. The bear hadn't walked here. It had been dragged. Her throat closed, a surge of fury and dread flooding her veins. They'd hauled it, wounded and helpless, to that tree. The chains, the blood, the bullet. It wasn't random. It was a plan. She straightened, her gaze darting ahead, and through the dense thicket of trees, she spotted it. A cabin, small, squat, half buried under snow, its wooden walls weathered and stained. Smoke curled lazily from a rusted chimney, a thin gray thread against the white expanse. Someone was inside. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a wild cage thing. This was no hunter's retreat. Not out here, not this isolated. She edged closer, keeping to the shadows of the pines, her breath held tight. The closer she got, the more she saw. Pelts hanging on the porch, swaying in the wind like grim trophies. Wolves, foxes, a massive black bear skin, its empty eyes staring at nothing. Her stomach dropped, nausea clawing at her gut. This wasn't a home. This was a slaughterhouse. She pressed herself against the cabin's side, the rough wood scraping her coat, her ears straining for sound. Her mind raced, pulling her back to the nights her father had come home late, his face grim, his hands stained with dirt. "Poachers, Em," he'd said once, his voice low. "They don't hunt for food. They hunt for profit, for cruelty." She'd been 10, too young to understand, but old enough to see the fire in his eyes. the same fire that had gotten him killed. She'd sworn she'd never let that fire consume her too. But now, standing here, she felt it ignite. These weren't just hunters. These were the monsters her father had died fighting. A noise, low, gruff, snapped her out of her thoughts. Voices. She froze, her back flat against the wall, her breath trapped in her chest. Two men, their tones rough and raspy, filtered through the thin wooden planks. "I told you," one growled, his voice thick with frustration. "The bear got loose. Should have killed it when we had it." Emily's blood turned to ice, her fingers curling into fists. A second voice, sharp and irritated, cut in. "Damn chain snapped. It's probably half dead by now. If we don't find it soon, it's worthless." Her lip trembled, a gasp threatening to escape, but she bit it back. They were talking about her bear, the one she'd risked everything to save. They weren't done with it. They wanted it back. Her mind spun, a chaotic whirl of fear and rage. If they knew she'd been there, if they found her now, she wouldn't walk away. She'd seen what poachers did to witnesses. Her father's body, riddled with bullets, dumped in a ravine like trash. She could still hear her mother's screams, feel the weight of that promise. Don't let the forest take you too. But she couldn't leave. Not when the bear's life hung in the balance. Not when these men were still out there, hunting. She pressed closer, her ear against the wall, every word a dagger in her chest. They were planning to move, to track it down. She had to decide, confront them, risk everything, or slip away and find the bear first. A floorboard creaked inside, loud and sudden, and her heart stopped. Heavy boots thudded against the wood, slow, deliberate. "Let's go now," the first voice muttered. "Storm's coming. We'll lose the trail." Panic surged through her, electric and wild. They were leaving. If they found the bear before she did, it was over. She had seconds to choose. Her fists tightened, nails digging into her palms. She couldn't fight them here, not alone, not without a plan. But she couldn't let them win either. The bear's eyes flashed in her mind, trusting, pleading, and her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She stepped back, careful, silent, her boots sinking into the snow. The wind roared, masking the soft crunch as she darted into the tree line, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had to move fast, had to find the bear before they did. The forest swallowed her, its shadows wrapping around her like a cloak. But the weight of the cabin lingered, a dark promise of what waited if she failed. She glanced back once, the pelts swaying like ghosts, and a shiver ran down her spine. These men weren't just poachers, they were predators, and now she was in their territory. Her hand brushed the bullet casing in her pocket, a cold reminder of the stakes. She'd freed the bear from its chains, but the real fight was just beginning. The wind carried a faint sound, a twig snapping, a voice cursing, and she quickened her pace, disappearing deeper into the woods. The truth was out there, and so was the bear. She wouldn't stop until she found both. Emily Carter bolted from the tree line, her boots pounding the snow, each step a desperate gasp against the suffocating grip of the forest. The cabin faded behind her, its smoke and pelts a grim specter in her mind. But the voices of the poachers clung like burrs, harsh, urgent, promising death. "Let's go now. Storm's coming." They were moving. They'd hunt the bear down, finish what they'd started, and she'd be damned if she let that happen. The wind lashed her face, icy needles stinging her skin, but she didn't slow. She couldn't. The grizzly's eyes, trusting, broken, burned in her memory, driving her forward. She had to find it first. She had to save it. Her breath came in sharp bursts, mist swirling in the frigid air as she scanned the snow. Tracks. She needed tracks. The bear was weak, wounded. It couldn't have gone far. Her legs ached, her lungs screamed, but she pushed deeper into the woods, the pines closing in like silent sentinels. There, a faint smear of disturbed snow, claw marks scraping a tree. Her heart leapt. She followed, fast, reckless, branches snapping against her coat. The trail twisted up a narrow ridge, the ground slick with ice. She slipped, caught herself, kept going. Every second counted. The poachers were coming. She could feel them. a shadow creeping closer. Then she saw it. The bear, collapsed at the ridge's crest, a dark mound against the white, its massive frame hunched and still. Too still. "No," she whispered, stumbling toward it. Snow crunched under her knees as she dropped beside it, her hands shaking as she reached out. Its fur was damp, matted with frost, its ribs jutting beneath the skin. Its eyes flickered open, clouded, fading. "Come on, big guy," she choked out, her voice cracking. It was dying, starved, frozen, giving up. She pressed her hand to its side, felt the faint, stuttering rise of its chest. Alive, barely. A howl pierced the air, long, eerie, primal. Wolves. Her blood ran cold. She knew that sound. A hunting call, hungry and close. A weak bear was prey, an easy kill. Her head snapped around, eyes darting through the trees. Shadows moved in the distance, too far to see, too near to ignore. She turned back to the grizzly, panic clawing at her throat. "We have to move!" It lifted its head, a weak groan rumbling from its chest, but its legs trembled, useless. She couldn't carry it. She couldn't force it. She had to try something, anything. Her hands fumbled with her backpack, ripping it open. A protein bar. She tore the wrapper with her teeth, the scent of peanut butter hitting the air. "Please," she muttered, holding it out. The bear's nose twitched, a faint spark in its eyes. It inched forward, jaws trembling, and took a bite. She exhaled, a ragged sob of relief. It was fighting. Not much, but enough. "Good boy," she whispered, tearing off another piece. It ate slow, shaky, each swallow a fragile thread of hope. A branch snapped, sharp, loud, too close. Her head whipped around. Something was coming. Wolves, poachers. She couldn't tell. Her pulse hammered, a frantic drumbeat. "Come on," she urged, shoving the rest of the bar into its mouth. The bear groaned, pushed itself up. Its legs wobbled, buckled, then held. Barely. She stood, her own knees shaking. "You can do this!" It had to. They had no time. A gunshot cracked through the trees, a deafening blast that shattered the silence. Emily froze, her breath catching. Poachers. Closer than she'd thought. Too close. "Move!" she hissed, grabbing a fallen branch, tossing snow over their tracks. Not enough to hide them, but enough to slow pursuit. She glanced back. Dark shapes moved between the pines, shouts echoing. They'd seen her, or the bear, or both. Her stomach lurched. Run! She had to run. She turned to the grizzly, its head low, swaying. Now! It lumbered forward, one step, two, each a pained stagger. She matched its pace, urging it deeper into the forest. Snow flew underfoot, branches clawed her face. Another shot rang out, wild, wide, splintering a tree nearby. She ducked, heart in her throat. They were shooting blind, but they wouldn't miss forever. Faster, she gasped, her voice raw. The bear grunted, picking up speed, its instincts kicking in despite the exhaustion. The terrain dipped, a steep slope slick with ice. She slipped, slid, caught herself on a trunk. The bear stumbled beside her, its claws digging in, barely holding. "Keep going," she yelled, her legs burning. The howls grew louder, wolves closing in, drawn by the chaos. A third shot, closer, a bullet whizzing past, burying itself in the snow. She screamed, pure adrenaline, and shoved forward. The bear roared, a weak, defiant sound, and surged ahead. Her snowmobile loomed ahead, half hidden by pines, a lifeline in the madness. She sprinted for it, keys jangling in her pocket. "Stay with me," she shouted. The bear faltered, its strength fading, but it followed, drawn by her voice. She leapt onto the seat, turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, a guttural snarl against the wind. She glanced back. The bear was yards away, slowing, collapsing. "No!" She revved the throttle, swung around, stopping beside it. It lifted its head, eyes locked on hers. Trust, still trust. Voices shouted, boots crunched. Too near. She had one chance. She floored it, racing back toward the main road, the bear's fate a weight on her chest. She couldn't drag it. She couldn't stay. She had to get help. The ranger station, 6 miles, maybe less. Her tires skidded, snow spraying, as she pushed the machine to its limit. Her mind raced. Mike Carter, her father's old partner, would be there. He'd know what to do. He had to. She burst through the tree line, the road a blurry lifeline ahead. Her phone, dead signal, useless. She swore, slamming her fist against the handlebars. The station was her only shot. The bear was alone, vulnerable, wolves and poachers closing in. She gunned the engine, the cold searing her lungs, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Hold on," she whispered to the bear, to herself. She'd get there. She'd bring help. She wouldn't let it die. The station's lights flickered in the distance, a beacon through the storm. She didn't slow, didn't stop, her voice already forming the plea she'd scream the moment she arrived. "Mike, it's a grizzly, dying, poachers, now!" The forest blurred past, the howls and gunshots fading, but not gone. She'd started this to save one life. Now it was a race against death itself. Emily Carter skidded to a halt outside the ranger station, snow spraying from the snowmobile's tracks, her chest heaving as she leapt off. The engine's roar died, but her heart pounded louder, a frantic echo of the gunshots and howls still ringing in her ears. The station's lights glowed through the blizzard, a fragile promise in the chaos. She stumbled forward, boots slipping on ice, and burst through the door. "Mike!" Her voice cracked, raw and desperate. Mike Carter, no relation, just her father's old partner, looked up from his desk, his weathered face creasing with alarm. "Emily, what the hell?" She cut him off, hands slamming the counter. "A grizzly, tied up, dying, poachers chasing it. We need help, now!" Mike's eyes darkened, years of instinct kicking in. He didn't ask twice. "Where?" She spat out the location, the ridge, the tree, the cabin, her words tumbling over each other. He grabbed his radio, barking orders. "All units, emergency rescue. Bring the truck, sedatives, blankets. Move!" The station erupted, rangers scrambling, gear clattering. Emily paced, her breath ragged, her mind still with the bear, its trembling form, its trusting eyes. Was it still alive? Had the wolves gotten it? The poachers? Mike gripped her shoulder, firm but steady. "You lead. Let's go." She nodded, relief warring with dread, and ran back to her snowmobile. The convoy tore through the forest, headlights slicing the falling snow, tires crunching ice. Emily led, her machine screaming ahead, every bump jarring her bones. The storm thickened, visibility dropping, but she knew the way. Every tree, every dip burned into her from the chase. Her stomach twisted. Too slow, too late. She pushed harder, the ridge looming ahead. She stopped, leapt off, and ran, flashlight shaking in her hand. "There!" she shouted, beam landing on the bear. It lay in the snow, still, too still. Her knees hit the ground beside it, her hands on its head. Cold, so cold. "Please," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Then a shallow breath, a faint puff of mist. Alive. "Sedative!" Mike yelled, the team swarming in. Flashlights danced, voices overlapped. A ranger knelt, needle ready, injecting just enough to calm it. Emily backed off, trembling, as they wrapped it in thermal blankets. Their hands quick, expert. 6 rangers heaved, lifting it onto a sled, its massive weight straining the ropes. She watched, helpless, as they secured it, her breath catching with every move. "He's a fighter," Mike said, clapping her back. She nodded, mute, her eyes locked on the bear. It had to be enough. The ride to the wildlife rehab center was a blur. Trucks rumbling, the bear's sled trailing behind, Emily in the lead vehicle, staring through the rear window. Its chest rose and fell, slow but steady, a fragile rhythm she clung to. The vet, Dr. Olivia Hart, met them at the door, her face grim but focused. "Get it inside," she ordered, and the team moved, gurney rolling, monitors beeping. Emily followed to the treatment room's edge, barred from entering. She sank against the wall, exhaustion crashing over her, and waited. Minutes stretched into hours, her boots leaving wet trails as she paced. Was it enough? Had she been fast enough? The door swung open. Dr. Hart emerged, gloves off, a tired smile breaking through. "Stable," she said. Emily exhaled, a sob catching in her throat. "It was close. Malnutrition, hypothermia, old wounds. But he's fighting." Emily nodded, relief flooding her, warm and heavy. "Can I see him?" Hart hesitated, then relented. 5 minutes. He's sedated." She stepped inside, the room dim, antiseptic sharp in the air. The bear, Kodiak they'd named him, lay on a padded mat, tubes snaking from his body, his fur cleaned, scars stark against his skin. She knelt, fingers grazing his paw. "You made it," she whispered, her voice breaking. His chest rose, steady now, a quiet strength returning. Days bled into weeks. Emily visited daily, watching Kodiak heal. At first, he barely moved, his head resting on the mat, eyes dull. She'd sit by the glass, talking to him. Nonsense, memories, anything to fill the silence. "My dad would have liked you," she said once, smiling through tears. "Stubborn as hell." Slowly he changed, standing, then walking, his gait unsteady but growing stronger. His eyes brightened, ears twitching at her voice. The staff marveled. His scars told a story of abuse, a life of captivity. Yet he fought back. She saw it too, that spark she'd glimpsed in the snow, reigniting. Release day came fast. Dr. Hart called at dawn. "It's time." Emily's heart clenched. Joy, sorrow, a tangle she couldn't name. She drove to the reserve, a vast stretch of protected wild, her hands tight on the wheel. The crate opened and Kodiak stepped out, hesitant, sniffing the air. He turned, locking eyes with her, a long, piercing stare. She held her breath, the bond unspoken but real. Then he moved, slow, then sure, vanishing into the trees. "Be free," she murmured, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. He was home, but it didn't end there. The bullet casing, the cabin. Mike took it to the authorities. An investigation unraveled a trafficking ring, poachers selling bears, wolves, anything they could trap. Arrests followed, cages opened, animals freed. Emily's fight had sparked it, but as she stood at the forest's edge weeks later, the victory felt hollow. The wind rustled the pines, carrying a distant howl. Not wolves, not Kodiak, but something else. She shivered, her hand brushing the casing still in her pocket. They'd caught some, but not all. Shadows lingered out there, unseen, waiting. She thought of Kodiak, his scars, his strength, his freedom, and smiled, faint and fierce. He'd survived. She'd survived. But the forest held its secrets close, whispering through the trees, a question she couldn't shake. How many more were still out there, chained, suffering? The answer rustled in the leaves, elusive, haunting, pulling her gaze deeper into the wild. She turned away, but the echo stayed, a call she knew she'd answer again. Emily Carter's journey with Kodiak the bear isn't just a tale of survival. It's a powerful testament to compassion and courage, standing tall against cruelty. From the moment she snapped those icy chains to the second Kodiak vanished free into the wild, we're reminded that one small act can rewrite a destiny, not just for one animal, but for an entire world threatened by human greed. Yet Emily's question lingers, haunting us. How many more innocent creatures are still out there, suffering, waiting for someone to fight for them? If this story stirred your heart, subscribe to our YouTube channel today. Every subscription is a voice for nature, a step towards sharing more inspiring stories and spreading the message of life. Don't miss out. Join us now, and let's make sure no animal is ever forgotten.